So, Tony, are you doing Hobbes today?
I am actually going to be working up to doing Hobbes. I don't think we're actually gonna. We might get to Hobbes, but what I want to do is we spent one day on the transition from the Greeks to the medieval world, and so what I'm going to start talking about today is the transition from the medieval world to, say, the modern world of the scientific world. And neither of those happened overnight, of course. The Greek thing, I mean, Aristotle died in something like 334, I'm going to say something like that, BC. And the what I call the Middle Ages started with Augustine in about 380. So you're talking about 600 years. But it's not like overnight the world changed from the Greeks to the Middle Ages. And it's also at the other end. I've kind of put Aquinas at the end of the Middle Ages, but the Renaissance did occur right. It started to occur after right after Aquinas, because Giotto is usually considered the first Renaissance painter. I'm going to show you a couple of slides of that, and that was around pretty contemporary with Aquinas, but then it's a couple 300 years until we get to Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael and Caravaggio. So it takes a while for these things to do, and so all of our boundaries that we're setting between the Greeks and the medieval and the modern are arbitrary, and I'll take responsibility for their arbitrariness, but that's what I'm going to do. I think intellectually it's defensible, though. So I guess what I'll do is start today with what I want to do is emphasize the way in which I can't be fond of the Middle Ages. Intellectually, it was a time when the Bible, this is a document by Bronze Age tribal people in the Near East, and they dominated the intellectual world of the Western Hemisphere for 1,000 years. And you basically couldn't say anything uh, adventurous that wasn't consistent with the Bible for this entire time. And I'm going to demonstrate that with starting with Eratosthenes. Do you know who Eratosthenes was, you guys? He was the guy who measured the, I just love this story. He measured the circumference of the earth, and he did it in such a completely brilliant and Mickey Mouse way. It's just a great story. Eratosthenes was a guy from, say, Libya, and he became the head librarian at the Library of Alexandria. And he was just kind of a brilliant guy, but he decided he would measure the size of the Earth. And how he did this was in what's now Aswan. He knew that there was a well that at noon the sun shone all the way down to the bottom of the well. And so he decided that he would see how long the shadow was in Alexandria, which is where he was. And he didn't have a protractor. I'm not sure something like a protractor actually existed, even though the Babylonians had divided a circle into 360 degrees. But anyway, what he did was he had a gnomon, what's called a gnomon, which is basically the spike in the middle of a sundial. And uh, he he set it up. Do you remember when we talked about Thales measuring the height of a pyramid by he'd he'd wait till the sun's shadow was creating a shadow that was the same length that his height or something measurable, so he could go, well, that's an equilateral triangle, and so now if the sun's uh, angle is equal here, then it's if we measure the shadow of the pyramid, then we know how tall it is. That was basically Thales. Well, kind of the same principle is being used here by Eratosthenes because he sets a gnomon up in Alexandria. And the idea is that at noon, when the sun is shining all the way down to the bottom of the well in Aswan, which is within 2 or 3 degrees of latitude, the same as Alexandria. In other words, directly, more or less directly south, Aswan from Alexandria. Not quite, but pretty close. And and then he would measure the shadow in Alexandria. And from that, he'd figure out what percentage of a circle it was. And I think it turned out, okay, so the idea is if the Earth is round and you have a spike that is set up by a plumb bob, so the spike is directly radiating from the center of the Earth. That's the spike in Alexandria. And then you have another place where the sun is directly going all the way down to the bottom of the well. Uh, Eratosthenes was smart enough to know that, or intuitive enough to know that the rays of the sun would be, for all intents and purposes, parallel when they reached the Earth. In other words, if the sun was a little light bulb, then the rays would come out like this. But if the sun was so large, which it is, the rays would come directly down all and follow a parallel line all on every part of the earth. And so at the edges of the earth, it would hit at a tangent, and at the, say, the equator, it would hit directly 90 degrees. So he figured that out, and then he figured that if you put something directly over the well, okay, that's going to be 90 degrees. So then he measured what the degrees were in Alexandria, which is a few hundred miles away. And he went, okay, I think it was 7.5 degrees he came up with by measuring the length of the shadow of the gnomon. Um, all right. So he knew that a circle was 360 degrees, and he figured out what percentage of um, the circle was indicated by this shadow. And then what he did was set some, uh, I think they were called bestimos. There was a profession in ancient Greece, which was an actual professional measurer. And what they did was with their feet, I think they might have had attachments to their feet, and they would actually walk the whole way from Alexandria to Aswan and measure how far it was, right? It was like an odometer, except they didn't have odometers, so they did it this way. There was an actual profession of guys that did this, and they would march out and tell you how far it was from here to there. So he measured the distance between Aswan and Alexandria, and then he had the angle. So let's just say the angle was 10 degrees. So he knows that it it's only indicative of 1/36th of a circle. And then he just measured that distance and multiplied it by 36. And he came up with the circumference of the earth. Now, the amazing thing is that it was almost perfect. I don't see how this happened, but I've heard different. I think it depends on how you interpret the measurements, but it was certainly less than 5% off, and I've heard it reported as less than 1% off. The distance of the circumference of the Earth. Now, that is the silliest way to, and the most low-tech way I can imagine measuring the circumference of something as big as the Earth, but he figured it out. All right. And then there was Aristarchus, who was in a similar period, about the same time. Aristarchus figured out that the sun was the center of the universe, not, or the solar system, not the Earth. So everybody thought the sun was rotating around the Earth, And even today, we say the sun sets. We don't say the earth rises. We say the sun sets. And it's impossible to, for me to imagine the creative kind of way of framing this question of Aristarchus so he could actually imagine that the earth was rotating and causing the sun to look like it was moving. That is so counterintuitive. And you're relying on so much analysis of your brain to figure that out, as opposed to it's so not what you're perceiving. But Aristarchus figured that out around 308 BC too. So by about the second century BC, we knew that the Earth was round and that it orbited the sun, or at least some people did. The way that Aristarchus figured that out, by the way, is was pretty squirrely. He knew that the sun and the moon appeared to be about the same size in the sky. Um, and he figured that the sun was about 7 times as far away as the moon, which is a vast underestimate of how distant the sun is. But he said, well, if the sun is that much bigger, then it's way bigger than the Earth, and it's the center of the solar system. That's how he figured it out. He didn't figure it out through geometry or anything. It was just, it makes sense, intuitively. All right. Those were the last two scientific discoveries for 1,500 years. That's what, that's why they call it the Dark Ages. It was 1,500 years or more before we got to Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. Nothing really was discovered. Aristotle was the Bible for biology, and Ptolemy was a Roman, say, a couple of centuries in the Christian era. And he had Aristotle and Ptolemy agreed on the geocentric theory of the solar system. In fact, it wasn't until last century they realized that our galaxy wasn't the entire universe. So these things proceeded rather at a snail's pace, but they were stopped dead by Christianity. Because whatever you thought, it couldn't be inconsistent with the Bible. I actually have the biblical passage that they were relying on. Let me see if I can find it for you. The biblical passage is from Psalm 104. This is the basis for believing the earth is the center of the solar system. That's all it is. Uh, it's a description of God, um, who walketh upon the wings of the wind, who maketh his angels spirits, who laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment, and the waters stood above the mountains. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's to base your entire scientific theory of what's going on in the universe on that verse, which is what they did. This is why Galileo got in trouble. Is astonishing to me. And in philosophy, I already said that I don't like reading theology because all of the answers are already given. They don't, there, it's not open to, you already know before you play the game who's going to win. Peter.
Tony, couldn't you say that what it's really based on is our perception of the sun moving around the earth, and that the quotation of that Bible verse is intended, of course, to give the authority of the Bible to it, but it isn't really in any sense the origin of the geocentric system?
Well, that's correct. But it was the scriptural, all I mean is it was the scriptural basis for it.
Yeah.
Right. The obvious thing is the sun's rotating around the earth. It's what Aristotle thought, it's what Ptolemy thought, and that was the standard. So I don't want to necessarily blame it all on the Bible, but because Ptolemy and Aristotle thought the same thing. But the fact that they just quit looking at, the
Sure.
from Thales to say Eratosthenes, these guys were very observant and very clever about figuring out what the universe was like. They were wrong, but I mean, the atomists, as I said before, the idea of the uh, periodic table, the idea of the first law of thermodynamics, these were all pretty crazily insightful or intuitive things that they came up with. And this is like a couple of hundred years. And then just nothing happens for 1,500 years. And I know people want to defend the Middle Ages and say, well, there's a lot of stuff. Well, in that regard, let me do this. I have a little slideshow for you. And this is, let's see. This is a PowerPoint, just a few sorry,
That's
slideshow.
cool.
Baby.
Mhm.
This is this is Byzantine art. So this is the art of the Middle Ages, and everybody's disembodied as let's put it this way. This is the Madonna and Child, and you have saints with halos around them. It's very stiff. There's no real background. She's sitting on a throne. There's a couple of angels up here. Um, this is Byzantine art, which lasted for a very long time. And here's another example. Another example. This is Byzantine art. Now, this is Giotto in the 13th century. Giotto is often considered the first of the Renaissance painters. See, there's a background. They're on the earth. There's a donkey there. There are other people milling around. They're not in some kind of weird space where there's no actual earth shown. So it's again, remember I talked about how in the transition from Greeks to uh, Christianity, how the cathedral was inside and you were protected from some tawdry view of the outside universe that was going to lead you into temptation. So that really, literally, this kind of iconography didn't show the real world. It's like we don't want to know about the real world. We want to concentrate on heaven and the holy people. We don't want to know about the real world. Here's Giotto breaking with tradition and showing, sort of a landscape there and an animal and other people milling around, and some of them might not even be saints. They might be common people.
Yeah.
And here we go. This is also Giotto, same kind of thing. And Giotto, showing the real world. And then this is now Michelangelo about 200 or 300 years later. And this is the flood. Now it's still a biblical theme, but look how he's showing all these human bodies, and naked and half naked human bodies. You would never see this in Byzantine art. You notice how in Byzantine art they were all covered up. Uh, and there's a physical world there with a lot of stuff going on, physical stuff going on. So the the kind of willful ignorance or screening out of nature and science for 1,000 years, I don't think I'm overstating it. I'm quite willing to listen to your arguments about defending the Middle Ages, because I love to be contradicted. It's kind of perverse. I love to find out something that I got wrong, um, and so I love arguments about this. But I just can't find it in my heart to think that these guys didn't kind of put the damper on human consciousness for 1,000 years. Yeah, Anne.
Look at Chaucer.
Chaucer was what century though?
14th.
Yeah, we're already talking Renaissance. That's not the Middle Ages anymore.
Not really. He wrote in Middle English.
And
Well, okay,
Philip-
now you're talking from a literary point of view, but Giotto was 13th century.
Right.
So it was starting to change, and I made the argument last time that the very fact that Aquinas would import a pagan as a basis for his thought, a pagan who wrote on the universe and so forth, was I think the break in the dike. But look, this is all just my interpretation. I can't guarantee this is true. Mr.
Troubadours were earlier than Chaucer.
What's that?
Troubadours who sang about courtly love, most of them men, but some of them women. That's like 11th century, 12th century. Um, I kind of agree with you about science, certainly as far as it's a theoretical activity, but I don't agree about nature. I think the Middle Ages had a strong feeling for nature, though it was a very, hieratic and in some ways fanciful view of it.
Wasn't the view of nature, and you guys are coming from more of a literary background, where as I'm focusing on the scientific, figuring nature out rather than talking about it poetically. And so I'm sure that you have the better of me in that area completely. But wasn't a lot of the literary stuff also kind of symbolic of heavenly things and unearthly things? And wasn't earthly love still kind of tawdry and sinful?
Well, there too, the troubadours begin something radically different. And by Chaucer's time, I think it's pretty strong. To make a deity out of the beloved lady or occasionally the beloved man is it's pretty abstract and it's very hierarchical, but it definitely makes love count. And it is essentially physical love, although the convention is, the distant lady is beyond being touched or kissed or anything.
Do you have anything like that from, say, the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh centuries?
I don't think so.
Well,
All you
I,
had was late antiquity, which was very decadent by that point, and I think Augustine was creative in a way that most late antique writers probably weren't. But he belonged to a different world.
uh, so yeah, like I say, I'm
I
making
agree with that about the earlier Dark Ages.
Doug. I'm Doug has had his hand up for quite a while. Can't hear you, Doug.
Cute.
Mute, unmute.
Obviously, this course is sort of Eurocentric, but my suspicion is that there was probably some cross-pollination amongst cultures that we just don't know about. What was going on in China, India, not to mention the biggest cities and civilizations that we know about were in Central and South America at this time. Very sophisticated and very large cultures. So, this is sort of, in a way, Greece is like a little backwater in the world at that time. If you look at the whole picture of what was going on and what we know and what we're finding out about the world.
Well, I confessed at the beginning of this class that we would be Eurocentric because we're just going to follow the typical course of Western philosophy. This is a typical Western philosophy class, and
I get that. I get that. It just,
okay.
Yeah. But I think my suspicion is we don't know. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. So I'm imagining there was a lot of stuff going on, cross-pollination between different cultures, between India and Persia and, the Muslim world and, even Europe, we don't even know about what was really going on.
Well, the Muslim world was kind of the repository of all the knowledge of the Greeks because they had access to a lot of the documents that we did not. For instance, Aristotle and Plato were lost. A lot of them were lost, but the Muslims had the translations. Peter, yeah.
I guess I'm sort of saying that the Dark Ages might not have been as dark
Yeah.
elsewhere.
If you expanded the
Yeah.
the room you're looking at, you know. That's
In
all.
literature, Tang Dynasty China from 618 to 907 is one of the most creative periods. But also in terms of invention, it's been said the three inventions that enabled the modern Western world were the mariner's compass, gunpowder, and printing. And gunpowder came from China. Printing, I think, came from Korea. And I'm not sure that anybody is sure about the mariner's compass, but it may also have come from Eastern Asia. So yeah, there is cross-pollination, and it takes a long time for it to happen. But when it happens, it has, spectacular results. The Chinese knew about gunpowder for about 1,000 years before they thought it was worthwhile to blow people up in war with it.
The what you're saying to me is just more of an indictment of the Christian church.
Oh, I agree. I agree. In that way, yes.
Hey, Barry,
Okay.
back from your appointment?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to call attention to is what was effective a repression of intellectual growth in the Western world for a very long period of time. That's not a couple of weeks. That is a very long period of time, and uh, we're just going to be coming out of it with Hobbes. Is why I'm bringing this up, because Hobbes is let's see, he's like 16th century, 17th century, and that's the first guy. He's going to be a complete materialist, at least he claims he is. Hobbes, I guess he had to walk a fine line. I don't know if you've read the Leviathan, but in the Leviathan, it's such a crazy book. We're going to take it to task a bit, but in the second part of Leviathan, he claims that everything he says, even though he's already said that there are no such things as magical beings or gods or souls or anything like that. He doesn't believe in anything supernatural. The entire universe is completely mechanistic. But he tries to make the point that that is consistent with Scripture in the second part of the Leviathan. And I don't know. That's some torturous reasoning there, but we're not going to get to Hobbes quite yet. Let me see if I've covered the stuff I wanted to do with science. No, 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 no. All right. Well, the first guy that we wanted to talk about as science progresses is Copernicus in the 16th century, and he has the heliocentric theory of the solar system. Now, Ptolemy had these things called epicycles. You can actually describe mathematically, maybe Laurel can help us out. You can describe the universe as, or not the universe, the solar system, mathematically by using the Earth as a center, but it's just completely Byzantine what you have to go through to do that, because all math is just kind of indifferent to where the center is. But it's much simpler to describe it with the uh, sun as the center. And Ptolemy knew that you probably have heard all this, the retrograde motion of the planets. That's why the planets are called the wanderers, because they didn't behave like stars. They would move around in the sky, and then every once in a while they'd turn around and go backwards. And this was always a problem, but it was known by Ptolemy. He had a way of describing it, which was uh, by in other words, he's still got a geocentric solar system, but the way he accounts for that is by these little things called epicycles. This is very crazy. Um, Now, Copernicus comes along and he dies in 1543, and he had his theory long before that, but he was afraid to publish uh, his major work because of the church. He knew it was radical, but he published it just before he died. Uh, and then the church banned the book about 75 years later, and they banned it for 200 years. And Protestants also banned it. Protestants also thought it was sacrilegious, the old heliocentric theory. So uh, the next things that happened were basically Tycho Brahe and Kepler. What they did was they Brahe was a very good astronomer, very good observant um, astronomer, and Kepler took what he saw from Brahe and he goes, well, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. All these guys were they had what I'd like to call a Platonic idea that the world should make sense. And it can make sense. It's not like the gods are just randomly doing things. So we should be able to make sense of it using our mathematics, which is what uh, Aristotle tried to do, Ptolemy tried to do, and Eratosthenes tried to do. They were all trying to make sense of it. And Copernicus thought it made more sense to describe the world or the solar system as being centered around the sun. But then Brahe discovers that the planets aren't really circling the sun in circles. They're ellipses. And to his mind, that was chaos. That was, it's the same kind of revulsion that Einstein feels for quantum mechanics. We have this idea the world must make sense. And this is a faith that remains unproven, by the way. We still don't know to this day that the world makes sense, but every scientist believes it has to make sense. And so what happened with Kepler was uh, Kepler goes, okay, well, the planets don't orbit the sun in a circle. Well, God couldn't have created something imperfect. These guys are all religious too. They're not going against the church. They don't intend to. God couldn't be so sloppy that he made these planets orbit in a sloppy elliptical fashion. So Kepler comes up with his laws of planetary motion. And the laws of planetary motion, I think it's the second law. Maybe you physicists, maybe Gerald or Laurel can help me out. I think it's the second law, but it turns out that what Kepler comes up with is the idea that if you take any planet and you divide the orbit up into consistent measures of time, that the area of the planet's orbit that's swept out between the planet and the sun is equal in all of the areas, that little pie-shaped things that go around the sun, they're equal. And so what Kepler thinks in his mind that he's done is reestablish the reasonableness and the logic of the universe. So it isn't sloppy. It actually answers to a plan. And Gerald, do you know if that's Kepler's second law? Does anybody know?
No, I can never. I don't even know Newton's by number. You learn the law and how it works, and the numbers are like,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever.
Well, okay, fair enough. So anyway, but Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo himself, now Galileo comes along and Galileo has a telescope. So he starts looking at all this stuff through a telescope and uh, he writes about it. Now, Galileo's not shy like Copernicus was. Galileo thinks he's onto something and he's ambitious and he wants to be famous. But he's also religious. He admires the church. And Galileo is astounded when the church prosecutes him for something that he knows is the truth. He just can't believe the church is going to go against observable truth because didn't God make the universe? So how could they think that my observing the actual universe is somehow contrary to God. He just was astounded with this. And of course, we have the Galilean moons. One of the things he discovered was the moons of Galileo, which are still called the Galilean moons, four of them, that orbit another body other than the Earth. So the Earth can't be the only center of the Earth universe. If I can see with my eyes that these other um, bodies are orbiting something else, Jupiter. Okay, so all this stuff is happening over a long period of time, but what it's doing is uh, it's a zeitgeist that's slowly edging us into the modern world. And the first thinker that completely accepts this, I say the first, Anaxagoras thought the same thing. I mean, a lot of the early Greeks thought the same thing, but the first, say, post-Middle Ages thinker that accepts this is Hobbes. And as I just mentioned, Hobbes even fudges his bets, and says, well, this is really consistent with Scripture. Now, Hobbes was writing in the middle of a civil war, and he was very concerned that the wheels are going to come off and society was just going to devolve into nothing but chaos and warlords and violence. And he sought an understanding of what was going on, and he was by the way very precocious. He was a really bright kid, and I think he did something like translate Virgil at the age of 8 or something. I don't know exactly. I have the notes, but Peter,
Yeah, he translated the Iliad and the Odyssey in his old age into rhymed verse, probably very bad rhymed verse. But I think as a young man, possibly as a boy, he translated Thucydides' history, which is, it's difficult Greek, not that I know Greek, and it's a long book about military and political matters seen from very close up. It's a pretty amazing thing that somebody as young as he was translated it.
I have here that he translated Euripides to Latin at the age of 14. So that's what my notes say. Anyway, he was a real bright kid, and he was really troubled by the English Civil War and all the violence was happening, and he sought to explain it to himself. So he decided that now he's really a watershed in a lot of ways because he is the first guy. This is the end of innocence, as it were. All of the major systems of thought up until this point had posited a glorious, primal, innocent era. It's throughout all cultures, really. We find it um, in, like, this is a theme in Jung and Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade and Fraser in The Golden Bough. They all note that there was once a paradise on earth. There was a peaceful uh, time when we were all at one with the gods, and there was freedom and joy and happiness and loveliness. And it's very parallel to the Garden of Eden myth. And then somehow we screwed up. That's the idea. Sometimes it's us, but other times it's the gods that had a thing. And as a result, we live in this miserable world now. It's our own fault or it's the fault of the gods, but that halcyon time of yesteryear when everything was peaceful and wonderful, we can't do that anymore. And most of the religions have a solution to this. In Christianity, it's the redemption through Jesus. In Buddhism, it's non-attachment. In Hinduism, it's the cycle of the cosmos. What we've done is violate Dharma. And uh, in Native American stuff, Polynesian stuff, we see these themes of there is a way out of this if we just obey this law or that law. This is very universal. throughout the mythologies of the world. However, Hobbes says, no, that's not going to happen. Hobbes posits a world where we are intrinsically at war with one another. And this isn't because of anything mysterious or any mythology or any time of wonderful Eden. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there's another guy, the noble savage, positing this dreamy era, or Bob Philby, positing a dreamy era when everything was wonderful. And I have to confess, I've never been attracted to this myth. It doesn't make any sense to me. I think I've said before that I believe in human behavior as well as geology. I believe in something called uniformitarianism. I believe there were people like Trump 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, and they were nice people like Martin Luther King 10,000 years ago too. I don't see why I have any reason to believe that they're angels walking the earth or magical people walking the earth. Although that's what in Christianity, all the biblical prophets were special people that had a contact with God that we can't have anymore. I never found myself even as a kid, like a 6-year-old. That all seems like bullshit to me, like um, Santa Claus or something. It just didn't make any sense. And I know it must resonate with millions of people, so I guess I'm the odd man out because just about every religion has it. Anyway, point is that Hobbes did not have this. Hobbes said we are intrinsically at war with one another. And his reason for well, if you want to psychologize what his reasons were, he wanted to support an absolute monarchy politically. And what's this? But what if it's all bullshit? It's not all bullshit. There's cow shit too. The thing that he wanted to do was to produce, I think, a metaphysical argument in favor of absolute monarchy. I think that's what Hobbes was up to. And so we want to examine the arguments and see if they hold water. He famously said, you will have heard that man in a state of nature is life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. That is the words of Thomas Hobbes. And he also said that in the absence of a Leviathan, Leviathan is his word for the government. In the absence of that, it's a war of all against all. And the reason he says this is he says that every critter is a material critter with material needs, and every critter is inevitably in competition with every other critter to acquire those necessities of life, like food and shelter, and also to protect himself. And those are just undeniable fundamental facts about human or any existence, any animal existence, any life is at war with all the rest of life. Who's that guy? Anyway, and so the only for Hobbes, instead of that isn't the fault of the sinfulness of man. It isn't because the gods have had an argument. It isn't because of a cycle of death and rebirth that's going through the universe. It's not because of anything. It's not redeemable. There's no solution to it. So when I say Hobbes says it's the end of innocence, I mean that. He doesn't see that there's any way out of our situation. There's no redemption from Christ. There's no absenting yourself via Buddhism and avoiding attachment. There is no way to escape this. That's the picture that Hobbes gives us of the world. There's a comedian named Taylor Thompson, and she's got a line like in one of her shows, she goes, "Who hurt you?" And that's kind of the way I react to Hobbes. I mean, Come on, dude. Like there's some cheery stuff around. Anyway, not as far as Hobbes is concerned. And so I want to just examine the argument. I think it's a really lame argument, basically. And it's an argument that you use when you like to believe it's a dog eat dog world. So whatever I do to screw you is justified because you'd do it to me if I didn't do it to you first. This is Ayn Rand and it's Donald Trump. It's their philosophy of existence. Um, so Hobbes believes that since we all desire the same things, we're inevitably in conflict with one another. And the solution to that is the only solution to that is a bigger hammer. So you join together and you have a large society, and the society itself has absolute power of life and death over you and everybody else. And that monarch, in his way, in his thinking, it's a monarch. That government can take your life away, can do anything it wants. It's the ultimate power. It's even a power greater than the church, um, because it has the hammer. It can do anything it wants to you. Uh, Now, there's a way in which this is not wrong. The government can do anything it wants to you. Forget about rights. If the government decides that you're a Japanese and you're going to get interred, then you're going to get interred. That's all there is to it. And that's what people fear about the current president right now. If the government decides, the government has ultimate power over the life and death of all of its citizens. And so he's not wrong about that. I just think what he's wrong about is the fact that cooperation is not a part of our DNA. In other words, the only motivation we all have is he says it's every person who does every act he does is meant to benefit himself. In other words, every act is selfish. Now, in a way, Socrates said the same thing, but Socrates comes out with a slightly different prescription. Hobbes thinks that if you do everything you do is selfish, well, everything the next guy does is selfish too, and you're all trying to better one another. Norman Mailer said in every human interaction, there's a winner and a loser. Norman said that. Dear God. Anyway, that's what Hobbes thinks is that there's a winner and a loser. And Ayn Rand, same thing. There's a winner and a loser in every. Uh, but the things that are being ignored here are so mammoth that basically it's just none of this is true. First of all, just biologically, we are social animals. So you can see animals of different species helping one another out. You can certainly see animals of the same species. Ants and bees are going pretty far down the evolutionary ladder. Ants and bees are critters that have they sacrifice themselves for one another willingly. That's part of their DNA. So you don't have to be an intelligent person to do the right thing or have any kind of false um, uh, ideology to do the right thing. People are instinctively guided to do the right thing or to cooperate. And this isn't because they're nice, it's because this is how human beings survive. If you were lost in the desert and you saw another person, you wouldn't try to kill him. You'd say, do you know where the water is? Because we help each other out. We don't kill each other right off the bat. That isn't our first reaction. And as we've discussed before here, in even the most basic societies, or especially the most basic societies, perhaps, ostracism is a death sentence. So I just don't see that Hobbes' argument goes through on any level. I think he's wrong from the get-go, from the biology of insects and bees and small critters up to our own biology. I don't see how he justifies this war of all against all. So that's mainly my criticism of Hobbes. Hobbes, does anybody else want to add something or subtract something even better? Yeah, Dennis, Doug. Uh,
You're muted.
yeah, can't hear you.
I'm reading a book. I'm sort of most of the way through a book called The Dawn of Everything, which I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's a sort of a revisionist history, revisionist view of human history. And it starts out talking about Hobbes and Rousseau. And basically, it spends about 500 pages
Whoa.
refuting Hobbes, really, and looking at it, the variety of possibilities in the political systems and cultures throughout human history. It's a really quite an interesting book, but it takes a dim view of Hobbes in many ways and looks at communal, consensual political systems throughout human history. You know, in large civilizations and smaller groups. Very interesting book.
Right. Another avenue of criticism of Hobbes that I want to mention is just the use of the word selfish. You can see, if you want to, you can say, okay, I was walking down the street and I saw a homeless person, I gave him $5. How is that a selfish act? Well, you could kind of create some kind of scenario about, I was trying to impress people. I was trying to impress myself with how unselfish and or try to demonstrate that I was better than this guy and I had $5 to give away. Uh, but it gets to be pretty extreme when I talked about Father Damien, I believe, on Kalapapa in Hawaii, did I not? The leper colony? No? Kalapapa it still exists today. It's on Molokai in Hawaii, and it's a leper colony. And when leprosy was just a deadly fear in the early 20th century, uh, they would gather people up from the mainland and take them to Kalapapa. And at first, they just throw them off the boat because they didn't have any dock there. They'd literally throw them off the boat. That's how terrified they were of leprosy. And so a colony was built up called Kalapapa. Like I say, you can still visit it today because some people got gathered up that didn't even have leprosy. They had ringworm, but it was misdiagnosed. But you put them on a colony with a bunch of lepers, and you're going to get leprosy. So they ended up having leprosy anyway. And some of them they don't need to be there anymore, but some of them have, since they've lived their whole lives there, they're more comfortable. I don't know how many of them are left of the original lepers. But anyway, so Father Damien is a guy who heard about this, and there were nuns there that were treating the lepers, and the nuns went to great lengths to make sure they didn't get contaminated with leprosy. They would burn all the plates instead of wash them, so they really avoided contact with all the lepers. Father Damien decided but they couldn't have communion. They couldn't do the Eucharist because there was no male, there wasn't a priest there. So the nuns couldn't conduct the sacraments. And so Father Damien decided he would go there. And he goes there and he gets off, he says, I'm going to fix this up. And he gets off the boat and all the nuns are there to greet him. And he says, well, where are all the lepers? And the nuns say, well, they're afraid to show themselves because they're so deformed, you'll be horrified and you'll just turn around and go back to Hawaii. And um, Father Damien says, tell them to come out. And they all come out. And one by one, Father Damien goes to each one of them and hugs them, thereby sealing his death warrant. He was going to die of leprosy, which is what happened. but he stayed on the island and became a priest. And so if you're Mr. Hobbes and you wanted to you want to describe every action as being selfish, and you're going to extend that to Father Damien, I'm just going to submit that the word selfishness just doesn't have any meaning anymore. It doesn't have, you're still going to have to determine which selfish acts you approve of and which you don't approve of. So that's a linguistic way of getting to Hobbes, is that he's using a language in a very funny way. Either what he's saying is tautological. In other words, the fact that I do this is selfish because I did it. So every action is by definition selfish. That's one way of looking at it. Or you have to say, well, let's define the line between selfishness and unselfishness, and then determine which acts are selfish and which aren't. Well, then if you do that, you've admitted that some acts aren't selfish. So Hobbes is wrong in that regard. So it's either tautological, in which case it doesn't mean anything, or it's false. This kind of statement that everything is selfish. We kind of get what he's saying, but I'm not I'm not persuaded by his logic. Yes, Meredith.
Well, Tony, I've heard this argument before in another context, that
Which argument?
the argument that everything you do is selfish.
Uh-huh.
The idea being that if you do something that appears to be generous or caring toward other people, you do it because it makes you feel better about yourself in some way. And that you're not going to do something that doesn't have that effect in the end. And so you can argue that since you're always wanting to shore up your own good opinion of yourself, you're going to be doing some things that appear selfish. Well, never mind. I think you know what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah,
you know what
I
I'm
do.
trying to say?
But Hobbes is, remember, Hobbes is trying to say that this results in bad things, a war of all against all. So if what the result is a cooperation of all as a result of selfishness, which is what I would argue the human race we wouldn't have a society if everything was as nasty as Hobbes. Because, okay, he says the only reason you are not killing your neighbor is because you fear the government more than you fear your neighbor, right? There's a strong absolute power at the top of the nation that could kill you if you kill your neighbor. Well, to a degree, that's true. Crimes are committed against the state. You don't say that Meredith is accusing me of something. You say the state of California is accusing me of something, or the municipality of San Rafael is accusing me of something. So the state does have this criminal power. Somebody say something?
Yeah, I said that it's a convenience to say that the state is charging you of the crime because it helps to prevent feuds and vendettas. But I don't think that it's Hobbesian in its origin.
Well, it is Hobbesian in the sense that in order to establish civil peace, you have to have an authority that everybody has to agree with, rather than or submit to, rather than vigilante groups that end up in feuds, just like you say. So, and it is true in Hobbes' defense that your government has, like I say, absolute power of life and death over you, as we found out in Vietnam. You want to not go to Vietnam? Sorry, you're going to Vietnam. The government does have that kind of power. But my problem is that that is not the only power. There's also a power that people have to join together with one another. And that is an undeniable power that's been with us. It's Also true of bonobos. It's true of chimpanzees. The social animals will behave in ways that benefit them all. And that's not because they've read the Bible. It's not because they've read, Aristotle or Hume or somebody. It's because it is part of our DNA to be social animals. Not all animals are social, but we are. And in order to be social, you have to have a certain amount of empathy and care for your fellow human being. And you can say that is all selfish. The reason I'm being empathetic with you is because I want to preserve my own life. But I don't need the government to tell me that. Laurel.
Well, two things. First of all, we also institute governments to support each other, although that might be denied by some in the current administration. But governments also are able to do things for each other that individuals simply don't have all the resources to do. And I think the book that was mentioned, The Dawn of Everything, actually talks about the history of having community structures, even not in the form of governments, that do this. And the second thing is semi-irrelevant, but why in Calvin and Hobbes does Hobbes have the name Hobbes?
What?
And,
I'm sorry.
Is that have anything to do with Calvin being Calvin?
Oh, I don't know. I'm
Hobbes.
not sure that's irrelevant, but I can't answer
It
that.
may not be, because Calvin and Hobbes are more or less contemporaneous, sort of, and not too long apart.
I had never thought of that, Laurel. I'm going to have to look that up.
So
That's a good one.
find out why Calvin and Hobbes. Oh,
Okay.
maybe Peter knows.
All right, Peter.
Well, a few things. Calvin and Hobbes both have a very grim view of human nature. And Stan Beer once said of Calvin that his view of human beings is that they're so depraved that any government they get is already too good for them. So they do have something in common. And I think Bill Watterson is, kind of making fun of let's say, the selfishness of childhood, which he sees as basically innocent, by naming the boy Calvin and the tiger Hobbes. But I do think, I don't particularly like Hobbes. He's not very likable, but I think he describes very well what happens when you do have people who feel that all they can afford to do is to act on selfish motives, and you do have a war of all against all. But I agree with David Graeber. I've only read a little bit of The Dawn of Everything, but I've read his Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. And I agree with you, Tony, that people do cooperate naturally, love each other sometimes naturally, and that it is possible for people to get along. There are states of competition where that becomes less and less likely. And there are also ideologies like, the atomistic ideology of capitalism that make it less and less likely. But Hobbes is very different from Ayn Rand. Her idea is human beings are selfish, so let's glorify selfishness and be as selfish as we possibly can. Hobbes's idea is this is a terrible situation.
Yeah, that's
We have
true.
to give up our freedom in order to get out of it. And
That's right. She's closer to Nietzsche than she is to Hobbes. But they share the idea that selfishness is
yeah,
essential. I'm sorry I interrupted, Peter.
oh, it's okay. I interrupted you. I like Nietzsche much better than Ayn Rand. And
Well, yeah, he's
the idea of what selfishness is quite different.
yeah.
Anyway, one thing about Hobbes, this is psychologizing him, but he himself started it apparently. In Roland Barthes' book, The Pleasure of the Text, the epigraph is from Hobbes and it's in Latin. And it's about how he was born in the year of the Spanish Armada. And he writes, then metum tantum concepit tunc mea mater ut paretet gemenos meque metumque simul. At that time, my mother was so afraid that she gave birth to twins, me and fear at the same time. And I think if you recognize that people can somehow, at least sometimes, get beyond that fear that if I don't, take it away from him, he'll take it away from me. If I don't kill him, he'll kill me. All sorts of things are possible that Hobbes didn't believe were possible. Also about the absolute state, it's been pointed out by Hannah Arendt, among others, that Hobbes goes directly from a state of nature where everybody is a freestanding individual to an absolute monarchy. But if you look at it historically, the family is much older than the state. There are injustices, obviously, in the family, but it's a very different kind of institution. And the possibility of community, the possibility of, love and cooperation and so on is there. And in that famous chapter where he talks about the state of nature, Hobbes does say very casually, the state of nature is represented by the savages of the Americas.
Yeah.
American Indians, and they have no state except the government of small families, which dependeth chiefly on natural lust. So he dismisses the family or community form of organization that quickly and that, with that little curiosity about it. So great things.
Hobbes is a reductionist, and like you say, he goes right from, okay, all critters are at war with one another like bugs are, and so the only way to control that is to have a monarchy. I mean, really, there's nothing to bridge the gap, as you say. There's nothing in the middle. Uh, if you don't have the monarchy, then you have a state of war of all against all. I don't think we even have to resort to any kind of abstraction to demonstrate that he's wrong about this. If you're in line at a grocery store and there's a feeble person in front of you who drops their glasses, you will instinctively pick them up. There's not going to be any even a millisecond of reasoning. Is this person, am I going to get anything from this person? It's not how we act. That's not how we respond, and we do it instinctively, I would argue. And that's not just true of us. You see it in other animals too, that they instinctively will go to the aid of another animal. And if that is instinctive, it's just as instinctive as wanting to kill the other animal, if not more so, that we can help one another. We're getting pretty long here. Let me make two more points real quick about Hobbes. That I think are kind of hilarious. Uh, I've always thought they were funny. Hobbes thinks two things make us all equal. And one I think is a really interesting point, and that is that we can all kill each other. We like to think of the human beings as rational, we're the rational animal and so forth. And no, he says what makes us human is we can all kill each other. And actually, this is true because in all of the other animal species, the dominant strong person, sometimes it's female, sometimes it's male, rules. You go to a herd of buffalo, it's the alpha male. In human beings, there is no alpha male that you can't blow away with a shotgun yourself or a little six-shooter in your pocket, as was demonstrated with the Kennedy assassination. The weakest can kill the strongest, and this is tremendously destabilizing in human society. It's a very stable thing. The classic example is pecking order in chickens. That's a very stable, orderly way to run your society. You've got one strong person and everybody knows their place and they just go about their business. This is kind of what Plato said in the three classes of society. If everybody would just do what they're supposed to be doing and do it right, we wouldn't have all this trouble. So that's one thing Hobbes says, we can all kill each other. I just think it's hilarious because it's so not what we like to, it's not flattering. but that's why I think it's funny. The other thing he says I think is very interesting is that no, we're all equal because no one envies another person's wisdom. I just love this. We envy their money. We envy their status in life. We envy their house or their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their car. Sometimes you envy their expertise at something, but you don't envy their wisdom. My class always goes, "Oh, that's not true." But if you think about it, envying somebody else's wisdom means just imagine it, put it this way. Would you let them be in charge of your life and make all the decisions in your life for you if they're so wise? Would you be willing to do if they're so wise, why don't you let them run your own life? And I don't think there's anybody that would say that, no matter how wise they are. I think Obama was pretty wise. I think a lot of people are pretty wise. I wouldn't want him running my life. I wouldn't want him making the decisions, the important decisions in my life for me. So I don't think anybody is wiser than me. What do you think about that idea? This is Hobbes. This is what Hobbes says. Barry looks skeptical. Ann's going to weigh in.
I defer to Julie on everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
Very knows that.
Very wise. Very
okay.
wise.
All right.
I think it's pretty true, but on the other hand, people read people like Thich Nhat Hanh and take their ideas very seriously. I read Thich Nhat Hanh, and I wouldn't like him to make all my decisions, but he certainly has influenced my own decision-making processes.
Well, nobody would deny that. I mean, I learn from you guys every time we meet. I'll learn something that I'll absorb into my little consciousness and try to go forward as an improved person. I can't deny that's the case. It's that overall, do you think I'm wiser than all of you? I don't think you think that. I don't think I think it of you. Not that I diminish your intelligence or dismiss it, not at all. But it's just a weird thing that Hobbes says. It's a very weird point he makes, Barry.
Well, it depends on what you mean by envy. Because I mean, do you mean, I mean, in other words, you can respect a quality in another person. Um, does that mean is that the same as envying that person or not? I mean,
I don't think that's the same, but I take it as I wish I would have lived my life like that person, and I wish I was living my life like that person right now. That's one way I define it. I don't think that of anybody. I wouldn't trade my life for anybody else's. I guess I would if I was down and out in prison and addicted to heroin. I might say, yeah, I'd like to be somebody else.
well, I mean, I think you can envy someone a quality of wisdom in another person without wanting them to make all your decisions for you. I think that, you know, there's this another basic thing about human beings is that we somehow want to preserve this idea that we have free will, and to surrender all of our decisions to another person would be to give up free will, which is not something we want to do.
Well, also, though, do you think that their decisions, forget about free will, do you think they could decide your life in a way that would make you happier than you could decide it if they're so wise?
I mean, there are people. It depends on the area we're talking about. I'm perfectly willing to surrender my decision making ability to someone wiser in certain areas where I think they have a lot more knowledge. I mean, I have no problem allowing the pilot of an airplane that I'm riding in to supersede my judgments about how to fly that airplane. But that doesn't mean that, in other words, I'm just saying you can respect or let's say envy talents in others without wanting them to control everything about your life.
Well, I think that Hobbes means something bigger than that. We, of course, all respect. I'm not going to go to a doctor and tell him I know more than you do about what my treatment should be. I think we all respect others' abilities, but wisdom is such a weird word. I don't know what it means. I always used to say that old age, wisdom comes with age, and people say that because they don't have anything else left, and nobody can define, they can't define wisdom, so nobody can say they don't have it, you know. Hey, Gerald's got his hand up electronically.
Yeah, the only way I can go with that question is to try to go into my own personal experience. And I do have one friend who has such good insight into situations and so forth, that I really respect that. I wouldn't have him living my life for me, but I do wish I had his insight.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that another piece of this, though, I think is that if Hobbes is really saying you know as much as anyone, there's also the fact that sometimes if you get people together, a group of people may know more than one by themselves, or been able to come to better decisions. So, I mean, I'm a Quaker, so I'm familiar with this through the Clearness Committee process or coming to unity. And there are times when people together do better than any one person by themselves, and even sometimes about decisions for your own personal life. It at least to raise the questions, and I think that's part of the wisdom, is asking questions that you might not ask, and maybe you're the only person who really can ultimately make a wise answer, but it helps to have a lot of people poking holes in it, as you are doing, I think, Tony, by teaching us philosophy and teaching us to ask more questions. So
Well, this is no different from what we started the class with, Socrates and Plato. So
exactly
it's
that asking questions and having people together kind of coming to an understanding and helping you see better by, again, by asking questions, and not being so absolutely sure of yourself that you think you know more than everyone else.
yeah, it's like what I said about Mark Twain. It's not the things you don't know that hurt you. It's the things you know for sure that just ain't true. Uh, okay, guys. Geez, it's always such a pleasure to meet with you. I don't want to wear out my welcome here. The chat has a lot of stuff in it, and Doug does this a lot. And so let me just look through it real quick, if you can bear with me. It's talking about Sufis. Merlin, no, 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 no. Oh yeah, Kalapapa. He has a link to Kalapapa. Um, okay, and Gerald, is he still here? Gerald said, yeah, it is
Yeah.
Kepler's second law. I can't believe I was right about that, but yeah, Kepler's second
Hey,
law
you
of
had at least a
planets.
33% chance,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. He doesn't have that many of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, and once again, just to emphasize the point, all these guys were pursuing the Platonic idea of making sense of the world, and had an idea and had a conviction that that could be the case. And that's why it was so shocking to the scientific world, the scientists, Kepler and Galileo and so forth, when the church didn't approve of them. They just couldn't believe it. And I think I mentioned this before, and then I'll shut up. The church now takes the view that the church was justifiably chastened by the whole Galileo business. And the view they have now is that their magisterium, which is the term they use, their area of authority does not extend to science. It extends only to value and the value of life and morals and so forth, but it doesn't extend to uh, physical science. So they've kind of gotten off of that. That's the magisterium of the scientists. Anything else anyone wants to chip in?
One slightly off topic is
Okay.
this love of circles as opposed to any other figure. I wonder if that just goes back to Plato and
Yeah,
his
I think so.
forms.
The Plato, there's these things called Platonic solids, and they're the so yeah, there was this idea that an ellipse isn't perfect. It's imperfect, so it couldn't be the case. Um, Anne, I think Anne just disappeared. I was just going to ask her how she's doing. Wow, that was poor timing on my part.
She had a chat as she left.
Oh, she did?
Yeah.
Uh, oh, and Tony, have to go see y'all Thursday. Thanks again. My life is getting brutish. Too much wheelchair. Well, that's what I wanted to ask her about, damn it. Uh, all right. Well, hopefully she's on the mend. Geez, that's too bad. Deborah says she's going to leave, but she's still here. Oh, no, she doesn't say she's going to leave. She's talking about Abraham Verghese.
He's a physician. I was just really passing notes in class. I thought it was a novel that Anne might enjoy if she liked the other novel by Merwin about about leprosy, because there's a strong element of leprosy in this other novel.
By the way, you could go to Kalapapa. I went there, took a tour. It was just amazing. I mean, because our tour guide was a leper. You know, and he was a leper who had contracted leprosy because as a child he was taken over there mistakenly and misdiagnosed, and then he became a leper. But just a wonderful guy with full of stories. Anyway, you can still visit it, I'm pretty sure, Kalapapa. All right, everyone. Geez, I'm going to write a note to Anne. That I'm embarrassed that I didn't get that out before she left, but I'm going to write a note to her, and I'll write it to everyone, and then maybe she'll respond and tell us how she's doing, and then we'll see you all on Thursday.
Happy trails.
Thanks, Tony.
All
Tony.
right.
Thank you.
See you then.